I was going to talk about you are what you eat. I was going to start in the whole Eric fashion, you are what you eat, and then wait. I think, in a number of years of teaching 2GB and David running the parallel course and paying attention to what has been happening at Sci-Fi, that is one of the postgrad programs that David Bergman started with Peter Zellner after it had been abandoned for a few years. It has been very interesting to evaluate through his work and through his contribution to the school the relationship between, and I'm going to use the word data in a very kind of general way, but how data loads into design problems. And as architects, we often think that that design starts when we're given a building program, or we're given a set of parameters out of which we're supposed to work out of and solve a problem. But people like David keep bringing the crucial point to the table that design starts much earlier, and that most of the data and the constraints that we inherit already condition what we design to an enormous percentage, a lot more than we would like to admit most often. So one of the first instruments of design is policy in a very clear sense, that if we agree that certain things are valuable, then it's worth designing for or against, nevertheless never ignoring, right? So one of the missing gaps that we often have in design schools is that critical knowledge that links the two up, that translates data and things like policy, things like urban analysis into design premises. And for me, it's often the best use of this connection that leads to the best projects. I think this can be said very, very clearly. And if it's not, it's because the political momentum of the cultural agenda of a place overtakes the policy or the database of that place. And this could be easily seen in places where utopias and dictatorships tend to rule. But in societies like ours that are very complicated and layered and have multiple actors, what David does is more essential to what we need than ever, and he is a pretty kind of seamless continuity in the fabric of what we do. I hope that everybody realizes how important that is. So I'll leave more of the biopic to you through what you say. But thank you. Welcome, David Bergman, to SCI-Arc.
Thank you, Juan.
Hey, my pleasure.
Thank you. So I really appreciate that introduction from Juan, because it goes to the heart of what I want to try and accomplish here today, which is a little bit different than the typical kind of faculty talk where you get a recitation of recent projects. That's important, but then I realized as I was putting together my recitation of my projects, it's a problem that I always have, say when I'm putting together a qualifications package as part of a team. Maybe I'll be working with a designer or an urbanist or architect, as the economics planner, as the urbanist on the team. The visuals are always somebody else's work, right? I don't design anything in that sense. I always say there's sort of a division between planners. There are those that draw and those that don't. I'm a non-drawing type. And so I have a project right now. I'm working with the AEG and their efforts to build a special events center at LA Live, where perhaps a football team will play in the future, an NFL team will play in the future. But the renderings from it are Gensler renderings, and I'm doing a film studio in Connecticut that will be a concrete tilt-up. And so there's nothing to see. So what is it that I really do want to try and talk about, which is my role here at the school is a funny one. And what I'd like to try and do is to expand on it and to think about ways that I can present information about what I know about, what I'm interested in terms of the process of city building, in terms of the transactional and regulatory structure of the city, and how that relates back to architecture, so that students and my colleagues on the faculty have a grounding in these issues that empower them to enter the discussion before the program is handed to you, that have the ability to intervene with their particular design intelligence early in the process, and therefore influence the contours of projects and ultimately the construction of the city. So for people who have been in my classes or have worked with me before, the first 2 points on here are going to be very familiar. And these are the notions that cities can best be understood in terms of their role as an economic artifact, that they're produced by the mode of accumulation in the society that's responsible for their production. That may change over time, but as we look around the landscape of Los Angeles, it's clearly a product of 20th and now 21st century capitalism, with all of its attendant conflicts and contradictions. But that at the end of the day, everything in the built environment represents a decision to invest in fixed capital stock by some actor, whether that's the private sector or the public sector, and that it has some sort of social utility, which may be rent-seeking behavior to generate revenues for an investor, for an owner, to create spaces for production, or also for social reproduction for things like schools and public spaces and those kinds of public goods that we all hope to and aspire to design these kinds of spaces. The next point is one that also we spend a lot of time in my courses and in my work thinking about, which is the mode of regulation. And the mode of regulation in cities really is how the competing interests in society that come about through the capital investment process, how they're mediated. And they express themselves in the context of the North American city and our planning and zoning systems. They codify the rules of engagement for capital, how it's deployed, and how it ultimately can express itself in the urban environment. But what always seems to be missing to me is a way of integrating this in a spatial and formal way, to provide some kind of a language for my colleagues on the faculty and for my students to translate some of these broader social science, historic, and policy concepts directly back into the physical form of the city. So today's discussion really represents a working hypothesis. It's something that I have been churning around, and really to start to think about how these forces interact in a physical way to produce the urban environment. So I've developed sort of a heuristic device, a way of thinking about dimensionality, and thinking about the three familiar dimensions in the physical world of a point in one dimension, an area, a volume in 3 dimensions, and then adding maybe 2 others. One is physicists are comfortable working with, which is this notion of time, right? And then a 5th one, which is where I spend most of my world, which is thinking about capital and how capital can be understood as a vector in design in the same way that that area and volume are. And that there's an implicit ideology and information about the built environment, about the city, that comes from each one of these dimensions. And so I want to explore what some of those thoughts might be. So first I'll start with the humble point, which is we're living in a world of explosion of point data between GPS and other geocoding technologies. We live in a world where we're literally swimming in a sea of point data from our smartphones that locate us and then can locate us at, with a very close precision, maybe 2 or 3 meters where we're located on the surface of the Earth, something unimaginable even just a decade ago, and then can cross-correlate that information with a whole variety of georeference data sets to feed us information. And that information can be, for example, this map illustrates where all of the Starbucks in Southern California are, right? So each point, it represents a geolocated Starbucks. And so from your smartphone, as you're traveling through the city, you can always find that you're maybe never more than 10 minutes away from one, at least in parts of the city where a typical Starbucks consumer may reside or work. So we're flooded with this kind of information, and it has some meaning in it that's inferred, but in and of itself, it's providing us just some generic information. It's sort of the baseline that answers the question, where is it? This is its cousin. The cousin of the point, right, is the line, which is a point stretched out. It's still one-dimensional. This is my journey from my office to here at SCI-Arc this morning. And this can show you also the same kind of information in just in terms of a Cartesian plane. And the scale of line data can expand. This happens to be all of the flights arriving at LAX on the 24th at 8:43 from their origin and their destination. So the point is a pretty humble dimension, the first dimension, but it is critical for establishing where you are in the world. It's literal Cartesian space that communicates location and direction, but any kind of cultural meaning from the point is inferred, like the comment about the density of Starbucks and how it moves through space. All we have is the data about its X and Y coordinates on a plane of the city, but we need additional knowledge that we bring to the table and context to infer what might be happening. Likewise, that line of my journey to work, you need to know what the origins and destinations are before that line has any particular meaning. So next I'd like to talk about area, because when we start thinking about area in the city, this is where we start to get very loaded cultural meanings. And this, of course, is the famous Noli Plan of Rome. And it's beloved by architects and planners alike, I think because it shows a very rich cultural information, not just spatial geometries, but we can see, for example, the Piazza Navona here, the remains of a Roman circus. We see Christian Rome overlaying the ancient parts of the city. So we see the Baroque and Renaissance periods. And this can all convey information to us about the cultural occupation of the city of Rome, beyond the kind of design standards that maybe we have typically studied from street widths and the relationship of entrances and egresses of buildings, etc. So it's packed with a lot of information that is not strictly spatial in nature. And this is the Fuente Hills Mall. And in Figureground, we can tell an awful lot about the culture that produces it as well. So we have a typical regional mall configuration, 3 anchors, inline stores, approach by automobile in a field of parking, This is clearly a pattern of urbanization produced in the second half of the 20th century. And we see this disconnected, isolated pattern of urbanization, again, generally requiring vehicle movements between different structures, and the use of land, a tremendous amount is given over to infrastructure and movement of, and transportation, movement of cars. Contrast this happens to be the city of Whittier, California, to the same scale. And so this is Greenleaf and Penn, sort of the 100% corner, the most valuable corner of what is a early 20th century a Quaker settlement of Southern California. And we can see in the block structure and the building structure is embedded with a different set of cultural information that implies, first of all, that the city, with the grid here, that land is viewed as a commodity, that it's planned from a distance and laid out according to the cardinal directions. And the grain of development tells us also that the scale of capital investment is less on an individual basis than we see on the case of the Fuente Hills Mall. Now, I don't want to overplay this because here are the figure grounds of some great monuments of architectural history, right? So this is here the Empire State Building, and this here is the Taj Mahal, and the Eiffel Tower, and the Parthenon, and this is, I believe, the Sphinx, and this is Disney Concert Hall in the Seattle Public Library. And in Figureground, they pretty much look the same. There's not an awful lot that you can say about them as pieces of architecture, what their social role is, how they function in the city, just on the basis of their form. So again, I don't want to overstate this, but in general, I want to make these observations about what area tells us when we look at this information for the city, which is one, that area is providing clues to cultural values of the society that is producing the city, and contains information that we can use to help decode the values that are embedded in the built environment. They tend also to be aspirational in nature. Almost always when you go and look at a land use plan in a general plan, which is a statutorily required document that's produced by California communities, it's always presented at an end state, at build out, at some point in the future when the city is complete or finished. And it's same with the Noli Plan. Although the Noli Plan shows different layers of occupation in Rome, it presents us, the city, as a finished sculptural object. And so it always has embedded in it this notion of the end state when you see an aerial plan. Next, I'd like to talk about volume, which is the last of the three physical dimensions that I'd like to discuss today. So this is a typical Los Angeles residential building envelope, right? A 15-foot setback in the front, 2 5-yard setbacks, and a 20-foot setback in the rear, 25-foot height limit. This is the world you get to play in. This is the beginnings and the ends of where any architectural intervention on that lot can happen, right? It represents a series of red lines, which are by code inviolable. You can't violate this boundary. And in that zoning envelope implies a number of design choices that are already made for you. You have no choice. You end up building a house that, if built to its maximum entitlement, what you're entitled to build on the site, looks precisely like what a child would draw if you asked them, draw a home. What does that look like? Maybe you'd see a chimney with some smoke curling out of it, but other than that, that's what you see is what you get. And that's because it's what you're given to develop on the site. Another related concept is the floor area ratio. This gives you a little bit more flexibility, but at the end of the day, it provides the same kind of limitation, hard limitation on the bulk or intensity of development that your design can eventually occupy. And this illustration is showing a floor area ratio of 1. So for every square foot of lot area, you get 1 square foot of building area. And in theory, there are different ways that this could be arranged. But at the end of the day, this, which is the most liberating of volumetric controls in the American land use planning system, still inhibits where you are. It provides the discipline that is really ultimately setting the boundaries of any design intervention. And this is not necessarily a new concept. Many of us are familiar with these drawings. Hugh Ferris's studies of New York's zoning envelope in 1929. So after New York City adopts the nation's first zoning code in 1916 with a required series of setbacks that allowed daylighting to come to the street, you are eventually left with a zoning envelope on a typical New York lot that begins to imply in Manhattan the size and form that buildings can take, and thus we have the generic Manhattan Tower that begins at the beginning of the 20th century and is really the dominant form for the tower in Manhattan, strictly because of this zoning envelope from 1916 really through the first comprehensive revision of the city's zoning code in 1964. So except for certain special exceptions, this is what is determining the shape of the Manhattan Tower. So volume really is the most direct artifact of regulation. And it really represents the place where state power intervenes design most directly. This is where the red lines of physical form are established in understanding the volumetric controls that come out of policy, typically in the form of height and bulk requirements, setbacks, daylighting, side yards, and access issues. And what's the magic behind them? I mean, if we go back to this, there's some kind of an ideology that is involved, or something that's privileging this particular set of volumes, and really it's fire safety that determines these setbacks. There's not really any other consideration as much as the ability to be able to access the structure from two sides, and to, if it's alley loaded, to bring the fire truck around the back. And that ends your discussion. This one here, it's about bringing daylight onto the streets of the Manhattan grid. So one notion privileges the establishment of these red lines, and they're set. And then the state exercises its power of enforcement through volumetric controls that ultimately limit or constrain what architectural interventions can occur. The next dimension I'd like to talk about is time. And time is interesting to me. Obviously, it represents history, but it can represent other things. One of the things that I want to talk about with what can happen in the city is that there are three states that can happen over time. You can have growth, you can have decline, and you can have relocation. And I want to try and dig into some of these a little bit and to understand how that affects urban form. This is a series of actually remote sensing analyses based on Landsat data. So from space images from the Skylab and Landsat program from NASA that use essentially radar to determine conditions and reflectivity on the ground. And this provides the terrain model that you see in gray in the background, but also combining that with data on the age of the built environment based on the combined historical records, but also looking at reflectivity and determining the age of structures based on their reflectivity back to the Landsat satellites. We see the growth of Las Vegas from 1907 out to 1995, and its remarkable growth. And actually, remote sensing technology has been incredibly valuable to us in trying to understand this dynamic of urban growth, and has been one of the most valuable tools in expressing it. Particularly from a visual point of view of visual understanding and visualization of the city. So this is a remote sensing image of Las Vegas in 1984, right? And the same view in 2009. So we can begin to see over time the intensification of development as the city, and the pathway of development as the city moves south along Las Vegas Boulevard and to the west in Clark County. And of course, Los Angeles. This is Los Angeles in 1873. This is a view from 9th and Spring, right? So SCI-Arc would be somewhere over here. This is an important point of inflection in Los Angeles' history because this is just before the railroad comes to Los Angeles and connects the city into the broader North American economy. So this is the Proto Los Angeles that very few observers looking at in 1873 would identify as the metropolis of a major global city region, the engine of the 8th largest economy in the world, and really one of the world's most important economic centers. So this is a series of illustrations that shows really almost within human memory how the region has grown out and urbanized from 1900 to 1925 to 1950 to 1975 to this point of build out at about 1990. And here's a view of that same corner, a little bit less obliquely of 9th, Main, and Spring. This is as it looks today, 138 years later. What's interesting about growth is that our entire land use regulation system in California, and to a certain extent throughout the United States, is predicated on the management and accommodation of the pressures of growth and the desire for increasing rounds of capital investment in the city. We have a very hard time dealing with the other two conditions that I'll talk about, which are decline and relocation. So decline. Very easy to pick on Detroit. And it's been in the news a lot lately as the first results of the 2010 census come out, but this is a remote sensing image, an aerial photograph of a section of the city of Detroit, where you can see the city like a child wearing her mother's dress is in too big of an infrastructure that it can support. We see the remains of streets and public improvements, sidewalks, electrification, implied sewage connections, et cetera, for a city that's merely a ghost of itself. Here is a series of examples, an aerial photograph of a section of East Detroit called the St. Cyril District in 1949. And you can see it in that state of being essentially built out. And then as recently as 7 years ago, it's, I'm sure, deteriorated further in 2003. So again, Detroit's been in the news a lot lately because it's no longer a major city. Its population is smaller now than it was in the 1920 census. Its population declined by almost a quarter between 2000 and 2010. And the city is in a circumstance where, along with the whole region of southeastern lower Michigan, where you have more of a built environment, you have more homes, right, more dwelling units than you have households, families or non-family households to occupy those dwelling units. And you have more households, families, than you have employment or jobs. And it's a cycle that will continue to see shrinkage over time. And we don't have very good mechanisms for managing this decline. One city that's on the cutting edge of this, and Detroit is beginning to look at these kinds of strategies, is the city of Youngstown, Ohio, which has a very similar dynamic to Detroit in terms of its industrial history and development, and is facing similar kinds of vacancy issues in a haphazard and random pattern that have greatly accelerated the costs of providing public services to the neighborhoods that remain behind. So providing police and fire protection over a discontinuous surface where there is displaced leapfrogs of populations, where you have large areas of vacant lots, becomes very difficult. Sewage, water treatment, potable water supply, all of that becomes expensive to maintain if there's just one or two isolated occupied structures at the end of a line. So essentially the plan that's being undertaken by Youngstown and other cities like Flint and Detroit is beginning to think about this, is a process really of reconsolidation, of shrinking the city down by rationalizing the zoning and the land use controls. And in that rationalization, really beginning to cut off those provision of those public goods to areas that are no longer viable, so that the city then does begin to shrink down into the infrastructure that it can afford to maintain. So this is the example here of Youngstown, Ohio. This one is the rarest, which is relocation, and it's a really interesting one, and one that I think there's room for a lot more exploration into how this process happens. This happens to be Butte, Montana, and Butte's a really interesting city. Here you can see the historic core of Butte right here. That's kind of where the downtown is. In the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, Butte was the site of the world's largest copper mine. And the ore body that is being extracted, or was being extracted, was located to the just outside of the city limits, but extended underneath the downtown. So that as mining went from shaft mining and eventually into open pit mining, and this object here is the Berkeley Pit, which is a large, now flooded crater with very severe heavy metal poisoning that has, from the ore body, that's leached out into the water, along with the industrial chemicals that are used to process out the ores, like arsenic is a common one, mercury, et cetera. So it's a very serious water issue. Here are the tailings here, which are also toxic as well. the town has had to move out of the way, historically, of the ore body that's underneath it. So as the city has had to retreat in the face of both initially economic and then later environmental pressures. And that environmental pressure is an important issue because that tends to be an important factor in the relocation of settlements. Is some kind of cataclysmic environmental change. And that's why I think that there's a lot of room for exploration into this notion of relocation of the city and relocation as a vector in planning. This is actually Glacial Lake Agassiz. So this is the lost Great Lake, about 8,300 years ago before current times. And as the glaciers retreated and carved out the Great Lakes that we're familiar with, right, they also carved out this very large valley in central Canada. And here is Lake Winnipeg, for example, some of the remains of Glacial Lake Agassiz. And actually, over a relatively short span of time, Glacial Lake Agassiz drained. It either drained out into the Great Lakes, out into the St. Lawrence River, up into the Hudson's Bay, out to the northwest, or down the Mississippi River. And in this process of Glacial Lake Agassiz draining, we see artifacts of the Paleo-Indians, the cultures that surrounded it and made a livelihood from this lake, rushing to catch up with it. And we see their settlements moving until eventually Glacial Lake Agassiz disappears entirely. And so with global climate change upon us, with changing sea levels, circumstances like cultures rushing to catch Glacial Lake Agassiz are going to be fruitful in thinking about how time and reactions to environmental changes will affect settlement patterns. This is from Richard Misrark's very famous set of photographs of the Salton Sea. So we don't need to reach back 8,000 years before the present to see this process, and we don't need to go any place exotic like Manitoba to look at it. We can see it in the 20th century here in Southern California with the retreat of the Salton Sea and its abandonment as a resort area and planning efforts that are underway for how we will interface and occupy the space adjacent to the Salton Sink as it sinks down, as it deals with toxic issues from runoff and eutrophication from nutrients and fertilizers coming in from the Imperial Valley. So conceptually, we're confronting this on a smaller scale today here in Riverside and Imperial counties here in California. So time tells us something beyond history. It establishes the pathways of development, the opportunities and constraints. And I guess the point that I would like to communicate is that urbanization is a cladistic or branching process that follows a logical pathway. And it can follow this form of growth, decline, or relocation. Those are the only taxa that exist within these pathways. And that each step constrains another potential outcome in the future as we move along in time. And then finally, I'd like to talk about the dimension that maybe is least defensible as a dimension, but it's the area which I work in my professional life and the perspective that I try and inject when I have the opportunity to sit on reviews and to work with students. And that's the role of capital. And again, for everybody who's been in a class of mine, we've gone over a lot of detail about what what this diagram means, but essentially we're talking about the fact that in the logic of capital, land rents and how much it costs to occupy a piece of land determines use through a process of creating a bid-rent relationship. The revenues that can be extracted from a piece of land determine the type of use that can occupy it, with the highest value uses occupying the highest value land, all things being equal in a monocentric center. A city, that point is the center, and value decays as you move away from the center. So the values are steepest as you come close to the center, and they tail off as you move away. The point behind this is that the logic of capital and the logic of land costs imply that not anything can happen everywhere, that there's a price to occupying land, and that discipline of how land is occupied through capitalism goes a long way towards explaining urban form. This is a really interesting study that was done in Hong Kong and was published in a Journal of Urban Studies in 2007. And this points to the relationship between building height, and Hong Kong's a really interesting place to look at this because it has very few of the kind of state interventions that we discussed when we were discussing volume in the city. It doesn't have height restrictions. It has very minimal site occupation requirements. So this is talking about the size of the parcel that a building occupies and its height in stories. And then the marginal cost to produce those heights is shown over time. What's important from the perspective of capital is that the bigger the parcel that you have here, the more the cost is going to require you to build to a higher height. You have to have more intensity of use. If you have a smaller footprint, you're less likely to have to occupy as much area or as much height, as much volume as you would on a larger parcel. And this same pattern shows up in a model of building heights in Manhattan. And this is from some unpublished research from professors at actually the University of Hartford. Barr and Cohen are the authors, but showing a model where they look at height and a number of variables to try and predict growth and development of buildings in Manhattan. What's interesting from our standpoint here is that if you look at the coefficients for plot size, right, and height, this is showing a strong relationship here, particularly in lower Manhattan, that the size of the plot is determinative of the height of the building, so that the more there's land value, right, and these coefficients of correlation coefficients are pretty strong, showing the connection between the size of the building, the height of the building, and the plot size that it has. And we can see this here in a historical illustration of Chicago in 1893, where you see the urban landscape is really being built with these extruded forms covering the site in their entirety without any setback here between particular projects, that as you have a larger parcel, you're required to intensify development in order to meet your return on investment. This is an interesting study that was done in the 1920s by an architectural firm, J.L. Kingston. And this shows the relationship between a standard Manhattan block and the height of the building based on your capital budget and the returns that you need to have. So again, the cost that you paid for the land is going to be a function of the height that you're going to need to build to occupy the building. And one famous example of this, right, is the Hearst International Tower, built in 1928, where only 6 of the original 13 planned stories were completed due to loss of capital by William Randolph Hearst. Couldn't complete the project. And it stood this way for about 70 years until its value could be realized in 2006, right, by this very well regarded Foster and Partners project that uses the original 6 stories as an atrium for the tower that can cover the rest of the site and extract the full value from the parcel. So this is another interesting set of statistics that shows in the United States the average height of skyscrapers over 100 meters by year related to certain key economic events. And what I think is so interesting about this is that if you look at the 5-year moving average, right, that the height of the buildings tops out as early as the 19 teens at around 130 meters. And even in great cycles of booms and busts, right? So we're seeing these built. Generally speaking, the peaks all come in at around 130 meters. And again, there's expansions and contractions based on different broader macroeconomic conditions. Why I think that's interesting is that, to me, it suggests that the technological challenges of building height are essentially solved in the first half of the 20th century. That it's not a technological limitation that puts a cap on building heights, but rather a value that can come from their economic function over time. These are the 4 basic measures of whether or not a project is feasible. So these are the 4 measuring sticks which every one of your projects will have been measured at before you get the program, or your proposition will have to pass as you're moving through the process. And these are the ultimate capital constraints that are required in our contemporary system for development. And these are net operating income, which looks at revenues minus your cost of capital or your debt, so your debt coverage. A capitalization rate, which is expressed as a multiple of your net operating income, depending on interest rates, a risk factor, and the cost of money. That'll determine what your capital budget for the project will be. A rate of return, which is a simple measure of net operating income over the total capital cost expressed as a percentage. And an internal rate of return, which measures a total investment yield that is equalized across the depreciation schedule, and it's expressed as a percentage. These are the 4 measures that every intervention in the built environment needs to address, and if it can't meet expected returns or hurdle rates, the project either has to be modified, subsidized in some way, or mitigation. There needs to be some extra market return that can justify why the project can or should move forward. In American capitalism, because there is a world where there are many different flavors. We live in a world where there are many different flavors of capitalism. So what is feasible in Dubai? What's feasible in Dubai is what the sheikh wants. That's what's feasible in Dubai. And what the sheikh can convince people they should spend money on. So of course this is originally the Burj Dubai until his neighbors had to bail the Sheikh of Dubai out, and so he renamed it, had it renamed in the name of his neighbor's family, so it's now Burj Khalifa. My understanding is the actual occupancy rate of the building is a classified state secret, but my guess is it's less than fully occupied. As we all know, we're living in the context of the end of the world, right? Because the world project is sinking into the Persian Gulf, as it also doesn't meet the occupancy rates that it needs in order to be maintained. So we can imagine circumstances where these constraints of capitalism are not at play shaping urban form, and maybe this is why so many of our colleagues and contemporaries are interested in working in an environment that doesn't have this capital constraint. It doesn't necessarily always produce the best architecture, but it can produce the most. There's no doubt about that. A similar logic is in place in China, in contemporary China, where we look here at Pudong on the other side of Shanghai, where the Chinese state-directed capitalism, which doesn't allow for land speculation, requires that developers produce structures and interventions into the built environment independent of market demand. And the reason for this is twofold. One, that owning land and having land and real property is a store of value in the society. So rather than seeking specific rent-seeking behaviors, this becomes a way of storing value over time. And the other are a variety of integrated political and economic issues whereby the municipality requires development in order to raise revenue, in order to provide infrastructure, in order to absorb a rapidly urbanizing population as China moves towards its goal of from being a primarily rural subsistence agricultural society to an urban manufacturing and service-oriented economy with the goal of reaching a 60% urbanized population by 2050. So I want you to think about capitalism as a specific technology that can be used for constructing the city. Other systems as have existed historically and exist contemporarily that are maybe different flavors of capitalism, state-directed capitalism, and we also have in places like Dubai and the petro-states something that approximates the what was referred to in the 19th century as the Oriental mode of accumulation. So other systems can exist contemporarily, but they'll produce their own radically different forms of urbanism and architectural expression. So that essentially sums up what I'd like you all to consider when you think about these 5 dimensions. The point as being generic and Cartesian in nature, the area as being a signifier of culture, volume as being the power of the state exercised on the project, time as being a pathway for development, as a cladistic relationship, and capitalism as a technology for development. So with that, I guess we turn it over to any questions or comments, or I don't know if there's any cookies in the back, but it's all good. Thank you.